What if I told you that a single afternoon inside Clarence House could have altered the course of the monarchy forever? Not a state banquet, not a grand coronation, but a family reunion that spiraled into betrayal, humiliation, and consequences so severe that even the most seasoned royal watchers were left stunned. Imagine it. The world's most famous family gathered under one roof, whispers of reconciliation filling the air, only for the gathering to end with the ultimate act of rejection. A brother stripped of his title, a father caught between loyalty and duty, and an innocent child at the very heart of the storm. That is the story we are about to unravel. But let's begin where it matters most, with a question. What happens when the crown must choose between protecting its future and forgiving its past? Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. From the very first moment the Clarence House reunion was announced, it carried the weight of symbolism. Clarence House is not just another royal residence. It is a fortress of memory, a place where King Charles once raised his sons, where Diana's laughter once echoed down the halls, and where the family has gathered in times of both joy and despair. The decision to host Harry there after years of exile was no coincidence. It was a deliberate choice, a statement. But was it a step toward healing or a setup for disaster? Think about it. After years of bitter interviews, Netflix documentaries, and memoirs that cut into the very heart of the monarchy, Harry was walking back into a world he had publicly scorched. Would there be forgiveness waiting in the drawing rooms of Clarence House, or silent judgment lurking behind every gilded door? Now here's where it gets interesting. The reunion wasn't just about Harry and William. No, the presence of Prince George changed everything. George is not just a child. He is the future king, the embodiment of everything the monarchy stands for. His innocence, his place in the line of succession, his very image, all of it symbolizes stability in a family plagued by chaos. And yet, on this day, he would become the center of a storm that no one saw coming. Let's pause for a moment. Picture the scene. The fireplace is burning quietly. The ticking of ancient clocks. A father, King Charles, frail, hopeful, and desperate for peace. Two sons, William and Harry, standing together in the same room for the first time in months, maybe even years. And then, quietly, George entering the picture. A child who should have been shielded from adult conflict suddenly thrust into the theater of family politics. Now I ask you, what kind of brother would allow bitterness to boil over into hostility against his own nephew? What kind of uncle, burdened with resentment, might cross the line? The answer to that question, whether true or exaggerated, would send shockwaves through the royal household. Because what happened next is the stuff of palace nightmares. Allegations began to swirl, whispers that Harry had not simply disagreed with William, but had directed sharp words, even mockery, toward George. Was it frustration? Was it a careless remark? Or was it something far darker, an act of intimidation designed to wound William at his core? Whatever the truth, in the halls of Clarence House, the story was clear enough. Harry had crossed an unforgivable line. And here's where you need to understand the gravity of the moment. For years, William had tolerated Harry's defiance. He had endured the interviews, the accusations, even the humiliation of hearing family secrets broadcast to the world. But one thing he would not tolerate was seeing his child targeted. Fatherly instinct took over, eclipsing brotherly loyalty. This reunion, once painted as a moment of healing, was about to explode into confrontation. The irony is almost painful. Clarence House was meant to echo with reconciliation. Instead, it became the setting for one of the monarchy's most divisive episodes. And the timing? Impeccable. Just as Charles had hoped to stabilize his reign, just as the world was watching for signs of unity, the family's divisions burst open like a wound that refused to heal. And here's the contradiction that makes this story irresistible. To the outside world, the reunion was cloaked in dignity. Cameras captured smiles, polite waves, subtle gestures of togetherness. But behind the walls of Clarence House, the reality was very different. Resentment bubbled, tensions rose, and at the center of it all, an incident so shocking that it would trigger one of the boldest moves ever made by Prince William. Have you noticed how the crown has always balanced forgiveness with punishment? History is full of examples. Edward VIII cast aside for love, Princess Diana ostracized for her honesty, even Andrew shamed into obscurity. But never before had the monarchy faced a scandal that touched directly upon the next heir. This wasn't just family business anymore. This was the very survival of the crown. And that's the point that makes this story matter right now. In an era where every royal move is dissected in real time, where public opinion can sway the monarchy's standing overnight, William's decision would be nothing less than historic. Would he protect his brother or protect the future? The Clarence House reunion forced him to choose. But here's the thing. This wasn't just about titles or names. It was about legacy, about whether the monarchy could withstand another fracture, or whether it would finally collapse under the weight of its own scandals. And William, staring at his son, knew exactly where his duty lay. Yet before we dive deeper into the confrontation, into the allegations, into the shocking punishment that followed, let's not forget one detail. This was not just a story about power. It was a story about family. About brothers torn apart, about a father too weak to hold them together, and about a child whose presence lit the fuse. So let me ask you, if you were in William's position, would you have forgiven? Or would you have struck back, knowing the eyes of history were upon you? Because what came next would leave no room for forgiveness. And it all began with a single decision inside Clarence House. A decision that would change the monarchy forever. But what William did next, no one saw it coming. What if I told you that the Clarence House reunion, the very gathering that was supposed to symbolize healing,
made me cry,
had been doomed from
and
the
it really
start?
hurt my feelings.
Picture it.
And
King
I thought in
Charles,
the context
frail
of
yet
everything else that
resolute,
was going on in
determined to
those
bring his
days leading
sons
to the
back
wedding,
together under one roof.
that
For him, Clarence House was not just a home. It was
it
a
didn't
symbol,
make sense
a stage
to not
upon
be
which his
just
legacy could be
doing
cemented.
whatever
If he could get
what everyone
William
else was doing,
and
which was
Harry
trying to
to
be supportive,
reconcile,
knowing what was going on with
even
my dad
briefly,
and whatnot.
perhaps the monarchy could breathe again. But if the cracks widened, then his reign, already precarious, would teeter on the brink. From the moment Harry stepped into Clarence House, the air changed. Witnesses described an atmosphere so tense it could be cut with a knife. The walls, adorned with portraits of monarchs past, seemed to watch silently as history repeated itself. Brothers divided, duty and resentment colliding in a quiet war. And yet, for a few fleeting minutes, there was civility. There were handshakes, muted smiles, the performance of family unity. But beneath it all, the storm was already brewing. Now let's peel this moment apart. Why Clarence House? Why not Buckingham Palace or Windsor? Because Clarence House is personal. It is not the fortress of state, but the sanctuary of family. King Charles raised William and Harry there after Diana's death. It was meant to carry warmth, not formality. And Charles believed, perhaps foolishly, that the intimacy of Clarence House would soften his sons. That memory would triumph over malice. But here's the contradiction. The very familiarity of Clarence House may have been what fueled the explosion. Every corner carried a ghost. Every room whispered reminders of what had been lost. Imagine William, standing by the grand window of the morning room, staring out at the gardens where he and Harry once played as children. Imagine Harry, walking past the staircase where Diana once greeted them, her voice echoing in memory. Two brothers, bound by the same past, yet standing on opposite sides of the future. Could such a setting ever heal, or would it simply reopen wounds? Let me ask you, have you ever walked into a place so full of memories that you couldn't breathe? That's what Clarence House was for them. And on this day, those memories weren't comforting. They were suffocating. At first, the reunion unfolded with cautious civility. Charles, ever the mediator, attempted small talk. He spoke of royal duties, of engagements, even of the weather. William responded with practiced politeness. Harry, though, was different. His body language betrayed him. Arms crossed, jaw tight, his words clipped. He wasn't there to surrender. He was there to endure. To prove, perhaps to himself as much as anyone else, that he no longer needed this world. And yet, something flickered. A glimpse of what could have been. For a brief moment, Harry softened when Charles spoke of his grandchildren. There was laughter, thin, fleeting, but real. Could it be that reconciliation was possible? That the Clarence House reunion might actually succeed? But then came the turning point. The entrance of Prince George. You see, George's presence shifted everything. Until that moment, the reunion was about three men. About a father and two sons. But with George's arrival, the future itself entered the room. A child, unaware of the tension, carrying with him the weight of the crown's destiny. For William, George was everything. His legacy, his responsibility, his pride. For Harry, George was a reminder. A reminder that he was no longer central to the monarchy's story. That his line, his children, would always stand outside the golden circle. And that is where the trouble began. Accounts vary, but whispers insist that Harry's tone toward George was sharp. Some say it was teasing that crossed into cruelty. Others say it was a pointed remark meant to sting William more than George. Whatever the truth, the impact was immediate. William's expression hardened. Charles shifted uncomfortably, and the fragile peace shattered. But let's not rush. Let's linger here for a moment. Why did George's presence matter so much? Because he represented the monarchy's survival. In a family riddled with scandal, George was the hope of continuity. To see him drawn into conflict was unthinkable. And for William, the protective instinct of a father overwhelmed everything else. The brother he once shielded was now the threat he needed to defend against. Do you see how cruelly ironic this is? For years, William had defended Harry. He had stood by him during youthful rebellions, during press scandals, even during the storm of Megxit. But now, the tables had turned. Harry was no longer the brother to protect. He was the danger to shield against. And Clarence House, with all its grandeur, became the stage for this silent war. Picture it. George, perhaps confused, looking up at the adults. Charles, torn, his voice faltering as he tried to defuse the moment. Harry, defensive, unwilling to back down. And William, his jaw set, realizing that something had just changed forever. Here's where history creeps in. The monarchy has always thrived on family unity, or the appearance of it. When that unity collapses, the entire crown trembles. Clarence House was meant to show strength. Instead, it revealed fracture. And this is only the beginning. The bullying allegation, the title stripping, the fallout, all of it would stem from this single, fragile reunion. A day meant to heal became a day that scarred. But let me ask you, could William have ignored it? Could he have allowed his brother's words, his actions, to pass unpunished? Or was he, in that very moment, forced to choose between being a brother and being a father? Because after George's entrance, there was no going back. The Clarence House reunion had set the stage. The storm was now inevitable. And as William turned to face Harry, the decision that would change everything was already forming in his mind. But what came next would make headlines the world over, and no one in Clarence House could stop it. What if I told you that the presence of one child, just one, shifted the entire balance of power inside Clarence House that day? Not Charles, not William, not Harry, but George. Prince George, the quiet, curious, innocent boy who carries on his small shoulders the weight of centuries. He was never supposed to be part of the drama. He was supposed to be shielded, protected, wrapped in the cocoon of security that comes with being heir to the throne. And yet, on this fateful day, George became the unspoken battlefield. Here's the uncomfortable truth. The crown has always been about inheritance. Who comes next? Who secures the line? And in that moment, as George entered Clarence House, the unspoken hierarchy came crashing down on Harry. He wasn't the future anymore. He wasn't even part of the crown's safety net. He was the spare, watching the heir walk into the room. And in that gap between heir and spare, resentment grew like wildfire. Think about it. To the outside world, George is a child of privilege, private schools, palaces, the finest clothes. But to William, George is his son, his beating heart, the boy who will one day be king. To Harry, George is a living reminder of his own irrelevance. That bitterness, carefully buried under layers of smiles and public appearances, rose to the surface the second George entered the room. Now let's slow this down. George, shy but observant, walks into the drawing room at Clarence House. His grandfather beams, his father softens, his uncle stiffens. Imagine the silence, broken only by the creak of the floorboards and the muffled voices of aides outside the door. William kneels to greet his son, hand on his shoulder. George glances at his uncle. There's hesitation in his eyes. Children sense tension before adults admit it. Did George feel it too? Did he sense that his presence had set something dangerous in motion? And here's the real question. Why was George even there? Was it Charles's idea to soften the atmosphere? To remind his sons of their shared duty, embodied in the next generation? Or was it William's, a deliberate move to show Harry the future he could never touch? Whatever the reason, George's presence was no accident. It was strategy, Or perhaps miscalculation. The irony is cruel. George, too young to understand the full scale of royal politics, became a symbol in that moment. To William, he was hope. To Harry, he was loss. To Charles, he was continuity. And to the monarchy, he was survival. Let me ask you, have you ever walked into a room and felt the air thicken, not because of anything you did, but because of what you represented? That was George's reality that day. He didn't need to speak. His existence alone sparked the fire. Here's what whispers say. Harry's remarks toward George weren't overtly cruel at first. A comment about his posture, a teasing remark about his clothes, maybe even a jab about how kingly he looked. But tone matters. And for William, every word sounded like mockery. Not playful, not affectionate, but cutting. As if Harry was reminding everyone that the boy's life was predestined while Harry's had been discarded. And William's reaction? Instinctive. He stiffened. His face tightened. Fatherhood surged over brotherhood in an instant. This wasn't just about words. It was about dignity, about respect, about protecting his son from the venom of resentment. But here's the contradiction. Was Harry lashing out at George, or at William through George? Was the child merely a pawn in the larger war between brothers? That's what makes this moment so tragic. George wasn't the target, but he became the weapon. And what about Charles? Imagine him, torn between keeping the peace and defending his grandson. He wanted unity, desperately, yet he saw the fault lines deepening before his very eyes. Did he regret inviting George into the room? Did he realize he had unleashed the trigger for the confrontation that followed? This is where the story darkens. Allegations say Harry's teasing escalated. A sharper comment. A tone that lingered just a moment too long. Enough to unsettle George, enough to enrage William. And suddenly, the fragile balance of the reunion shattered. But let's not forget the human side. George, barely old enough to grasp the complexity of what was happening, may have only felt confusion. He wasn't expecting to be in the crossfire of adult bitterness. The irony is that in trying to shield his son, William made him the very center of the storm. And what about you? If your child were in that position, vulnerable, confused, made the subject of sharp remarks by your own brother, what would you do? Would you laugh it off, or would you rise up, protective and unyielding? William chose the latter. He stood taller. His eyes sharpened. His tone grew colder. This was no longer a reunion. It was a standoff. And George, unwittingly, was the spark. The tragedy is clear. George should have been a symbol of unity. Instead, he became the emblem of division. His innocence was overshadowed by adult conflict. And once the line was crossed, there was no going back. Clarence House, once filled with the echoes of childhood laughter, now carried the sound of fractured trust. Brothers at war. A father powerless. A child caught in the middle. And yet, this was only the beginning. Because what happened next would turn a family quarrel into a royal crisis. And the next move, the one that no one saw coming, would forever change the way the world saw Prince Harry. What if I told you that the very word, bullying, is the one word that terrifies the monarchy more than almost any other? Scandal, yes. Affairs, yes. But bullying? That cuts deeper, because it strikes at the heart of innocence, at the very image of the monarchy as guardian of the next generation. And when whispers began to circle that Harry, the spare, had crossed the line with George, the heir, the story transformed from a family quarrel into an allegation that could rock the crown itself. Let's not sugarcoat this. The word bullying carries weight. It conjures images of intimidation, power imbalances, and cruelty. And to attach it to Prince Harry, once beloved as the cheeky, fun-loving uncle, the cool royal who could make children laugh, was unthinkable. Yet Clarence House was now buzzing with murmurs that something had happened. Something sharp, something cruel, something that William would not forgive. Here's how the accounts unfold. The teasing, at first, was light. A comment about George being too serious. A jab that he looked like a miniature version of his father, stiff and dull. To most ears, perhaps it would have sounded like playful banter. But tone matters. And Harry's tone, sharpened by years of bitterness, was not playful. It was biting, directed at George, but meant to wound William. And George? Imagine being a child in that moment. Old enough to understand mockery, too young to process the venom behind it. His face reportedly fell. His silence spoke louder than words. Children don't always need to answer to reveal the sting. They show it in their eyes, in their posture, in the sudden quietness that fills the room. That's when William stepped in. No hesitation. No polite smiles. His protective instincts surged. He told Harry to stop. Firmly. Sharply. In a way that stunned even Charles. But Harry didn't stop. He pushed further. Another remark, this time more direct. Some say he questioned whether George really knew what he was in for as future king. Others claim he mocked the weight George would carry, saying the boy was already trapped, just like us. Here's the contradiction that makes this moment unforgettable. On one hand, Harry wasn't entirely wrong. The monarchy is a gilded cage. George will grow up under pressures most children could never imagine. But the way Harry said it, in that moment, with George present, was not compassion. It was cruelty disguised as truth. And William snapped. Not with violence, but with words sharp enough to cut through the thick silence. He accused Harry of bullying. Not teasing, not joking, bullying. And once the word was spoken, it could never be unsaid. Let me ask you, what would you have done? If your brother mocked your child in front of you, knowing your child couldn't defend himself, would you laugh it off? Would you excuse it as banter? Or would you, like William, draw a line in the sand? Charles, caught in the middle, tried to calm the storm. He urged restraint, pleaded for civility. But the damage was done. George, now visibly uncomfortable, shifted closer to his father. William placed a protective hand on his shoulder. The image was devastating. The future king shielding the next king from the family's rogue prince. And Harry? He laughed. Not joyfully, not warmly, but the kind of laugh that drips with defiance. As if to say, you think you can silence me? You think you can pretend this family isn't broken? That laugh only inflamed William further. From that moment, the incident was no longer private. Aides whispered. Advisors stiffened. The word bullying made its way through Clarence House like a contagion. By the time the family left the drawing room, the story had already grown wings. But let's pause here, because it's important to understand what bullying means in the royal context. This isn't just about schoolyard taunts. This is about optics, about perception. If the public believed Harry had bullied George, the monarchy's image would collapse into chaos. The uncle who fled the crown attacking the child who will one day wear it? That's not family drama. That's betrayal of dynasty. And William knew it. That's why he acted so decisively. That's why he refused to let it slide. Because for him, this wasn't just about George's feelings in that moment. It was about protecting the monarchy itself. The irony? Harry himself has long spoken out against bullying. He has positioned himself as an advocate for the vulnerable, a champion for mental health, a voice for the voiceless. And yet here he was, accused of doing the very thing he condemned. The contradiction was staggering. Do you see the layers? A reunion meant to heal became an allegation of cruelty. A child meant to symbolize hope became a symbol of division. And a brother once loved as the fun uncle was now whispered about as a bully. But here's the kicker. Once William made the accusation, he couldn't take it back. Harry couldn't laugh it off. Charles couldn't bury it. The damage was irreversible. And that's when the thought, the unthinkable thought, began to take root in William's mind. If Harry could not be trusted around George, then could he be trusted with the dignity of his title? Because what William considered next was not just punishment. It was a move so historic, so shocking, that it would echo across the world. But before that decision was made, the confrontation between the brothers was about to escalate. And what came out of Harry's mouth next would leave everyone in Clarence House in stunned silence. What if I told you that in the space of just a few seconds, Prince William's entire role as a brother shattered, and his identity as a father took complete control? That was the moment inside Clarence House when William's breaking point arrived. Years of pain, resentment, betrayal, and disappointment all collided in one instant. And at the center of it all, his son, the boy who would one day be king. The boy who, in William's eyes, had just been mocked and belittled by his own uncle. William had always carried the burden of being both protector and heir. Protector of the monarchy. Protector of his father. Protector, even, of Harry during their youth. But now, standing face to face with his brother, he realized the tables had turned. He no longer needed to shield Harry. He needed to shield George from Harry. Let's rewind just a little. For decades, William had endured Harry's wild streaks. He tolerated the reckless years, the parties, the headlines, the scandals. He defended him publicly, shielded him from the worst of the press, and reminded the palace staff constantly that Harry was family first. Even after Meghan entered the picture, when the palace began to fracture, William still held on to some semblance of loyalty. He wanted to believe there was a way back. He wanted to believe his brother, despite everything, could still be part of the family's future. But this was different. Words spoken in anger are one thing, but words aimed at an innocent child? That William could never forgive. And so his voice, calm at first, grew sharper, firmer, each syllable dripping with the authority not just of a father, but of a future king. He told Harry, in no uncertain terms, that his behavior was unacceptable, that George was off limits, that this was no longer about petty squabbles or sibling rivalry. This was about respect, about dignity, about the monarchy's future. Harry, of course, pushed back. He accused William of being overly sensitive. He claimed his remarks were harmless, that the royal family had bigger problems than a joke taken too seriously. And that's when the real fracture widened. Because to William, it wasn't just a joke. It was proof that Harry no longer understood the line between banter and cruelty, between family and duty. Let me ask you, how many times can you forgive someone before the forgiveness becomes weakness? How many times can you turn the other cheek before you realize that protecting one relationship is destroying another? For William, that realization came in a flash. He could no longer defend Harry without betraying his son, and he chose George. Now picture the room. Charles, his voice trembling, trying desperately to restore calm. Aides shifting uncomfortably by the doorway. George looking up, wide-eyed, confused by the anger swirling around him. And William, his face set, his tone final, making it clear that the old rules no longer applied. This was his breaking point. The irony, of course, is heartbreaking. Diana once dreamed that her boys would be each other's greatest allies. She wanted them to be partners, a united front against the pressures of the crown. And for a time, they were. But Clarence House revealed the cruel twist of fate. Instead of being each other's shield, they had become each other's weapon. William's breaking point wasn't just about the alleged bullying. It was about years of strain exploding in a single moment. Think about it. Harry had left the monarchy, criticized the family, accused them of cruelty, racism, and neglect. He had written memoirs, produced documentaries, sat in interviews that left the palace reeling. William had stayed silent through it all, bearing the weight of duty. But silence has a limit. And when Harry crossed the line with George, that limit was shattered. Here's the contradiction that makes this moment so dramatic. William was supposed to be the calm one, the measured one, the brother who could absorb insult after insult without breaking. But now, the very thing that gave him strength, his restraint, turned into his weakness. Because when he finally snapped, he snapped hard. And there was no going back. Charles, seeing the fury in his eldest son, reportedly tried to intervene. He reminded William of Diana's wishes. He pleaded for calm, for compassion. But William was past that point. Compassion had been replaced by conviction. Protect George at all costs, even if it meant severing ties with Harry once and for all. And Harry? He didn't back down. He fired back. He accused William of hypocrisy, of living a lie, of hiding behind the crown while claiming to be a family man. He twisted William's silence into cowardice, his duty into arrogance. The words were brutal, personal, and cutting. But for William, they only confirmed what he already knew. This was no longer his brother. This was an adversary. Let me put this to you directly. If you were in William's shoes, standing in that room, would you have walked away? Would you have tried one last time to mend the bond? Or would you have done what William did? Draw a line so sharp, so final, that it could never be crossed again. Because make no mistake, William's breaking point wasn't just emotional. It was decisive. He knew, in that moment, that something irreversible had to happen. That Harry could no longer carry his title, not if the monarchy was to survive. And here's where the tension builds to its highest point. Clarence House, once a place of memory and comfort, became the birthplace of a historic decision. William's breaking point turned into a plan that would leave Harry stripped, humiliated, and cast further into exile. But the moment that sealed it, the final spark that pushed William from fury into action, that came not from George, not from Charles, but from Harry himself. when he uttered a line so venomous, so shocking, that even the walls of Clarence House seemed to fall silent. And once those words were spoken, William knew there was no turning back. Because what Harry said next would not only ignite William's fury, it would seal his fate. What if I told you that King Charles, father, monarch, and desperate peacemaker, stood in that Clarence House room like a man watching his entire legacy collapse in real time? Imagine the scene. His eldest son, the future king, standing rigid with fury. His youngest son, defiant, smirking, and reckless. His grandson, wide-eyed, confused, caught in the crossfire. This wasn't a family spat anymore. It was a royal implosion, and Charles was right in the middle of it. For years, Charles had balanced two impossible roles. On one hand, he was king, the embodiment of the crown, the figure who had to show strength to the world. On the other, he was still a father, burdened with the impossible task of mending two sons who had grown into rivals instead of allies. But that day, inside Clarence House, those roles collided. And no matter which way he turned, Charles was destined to lose. Think about the pressure pressing down on him. He had spent decades waiting for the throne, enduring scandal, public hatred, and criticism. Now he finally wore the crown, but it was fragile. His approval ratings, though steady, were not ironclad. The monarchy itself was under attack from within and without, Meghan and Harry's accusations on one side, Republican movements on the other. Charles needed unity. He needed calm. He needed his sons to show the world that the monarchy was a family first, an institution second. Instead, he was confronted with chaos. William, his face flushed with anger, had just accused Harry of bullying. Harry, arms crossed, refused to back down. He even spat out a line that made everyone freeze, a taunt directed at William's role as both father and heir. Something along the lines of, "He'll never have a normal life, Will. Just like you never did. Maybe one day George will hate you the way I hated Dad." That line was poison. William lunged forward verbally, his voice shaking with rage. George shrank into his father's side. Charles, stunned, lifted a trembling hand, his voice cracking. "Enough. Both of you. This cannot go on." But it did. Because here's the truth. Charles had never been able to fully control his sons. Not as children. Not as adults. Diana's shadow loomed too large. The rivalry between William and Harry had taken on a life of its own, fed by grief, by media narratives, by jealousy, and by duty. Charles, always the reserved one, never knew how to bridge the chasm. And now, standing between them, he realized he couldn't. Here's the contradiction that makes this moment so devastating. Charles wanted to be the monarch who healed, the father who unified. Yet in trying to bring his sons together at Clarence House, he had only pulled the cracks wider. His very attempt at reconciliation had become the spark for further destruction. And the stakes? They couldn't have been higher. Because Charles knew the world would eventually hear about this. Secrets never stay buried in palaces. Advisors talk. Aides whisper. Newspapers dig. And once the story leaked, that Harry had allegedly bullied George, that William had exploded, that Charles had stood powerless, the monarchy's image would crumble. The crown could not survive another Diana-level scandal. So Charles did what he always does. He pleaded. He begged. He tried to appeal to the memory of family. He invoked Diana's name, reminding them of her dream for her sons to stand united. His words trembled, not just with emotion, but with fear. Fear that he was watching history repeat itself, brothers torn apart, the monarchy suffering as collateral damage. But here's the tragic irony. The more Charles pleaded, the weaker he looked. William, full of righteous fury, saw a father too soft, too indecisive. Harry, defiant and bitter, saw a monarch clinging to outdated notions of family loyalty. And George? He saw his grandfather powerless to stop the storm. Do you see the picture? The King of England, supposedly the most powerful man in the nation, reduced to a broken father, whispering for calm while his sons tore each other apart. But Charles wasn't just broken. He was calculating too. Behind his trembling words, a thought began to form. If William stripped Harry's title, could Charles stop it? Should he stop it? Or was it time to let his heir take control? Because Charles knew one thing above all else. The future of the monarchy didn't rest with him anymore. It rested with William and George. This was Charles's torment. Protect the spare, or protect the heir? shield Harry from disgrace, or allow William to defend George. Every option was agony. Every path led to loss. Let me ask you, what would you have done? If you were a father, would you prioritize the son who betrayed you, or the son who would carry your legacy? If you were a king, would you sacrifice your own child to preserve the crown? Charles, that day, realized he couldn't be both father and king. He had to choose, and the choice was tearing him apart. The room fell silent for a moment. Charles, weary, pressed his hand to his forehead. William stood like a sentinel beside George. Harry, arms folded, glared at them both. The gulf was visible, physical, undeniable. And Charles, finally, whispered the words that changed everything. William, do what you must. But remember, he is still your brother. In that moment, Charles surrendered. He handed the decision over to William. He acknowledged that he could no longer bridge the divide. He placed the weight of the monarchy's survival squarely on his eldest son's shoulders. And William, hearing those words, knew exactly what he had to do. Because what came next would not be an argument. It would be a verdict. And the punishment waiting for Harry was something no one had dared imagine until that day. What if I told you that history shifted in a single breath? That within the walls of Clarence House, Prince William made a decision that would echo through the monarchy for generations. This wasn't whispered gossip. This wasn't speculation. This was action. Cold, deliberate, irreversible action. The moment William stripped Harry of his royal title wasn't just about punishment. It was about survival. The survival of the crown. The survival of George's future. And the survival of William's own identity as both father and heir. The silence in the room after Charles's words was suffocating. Do what you must. But remember, he is still your brother. It was both blessing and curse. It was permission and warning. And William, standing tall, knew what it meant. The choice was his now. The weight of history sat squarely on his shoulders. And he did not hesitate. For years, William had endured Harry's defiance. He had watched his brother mock traditions, abandon duty, sell stories, and weaponize their family against them in interviews, books, and documentaries. But this was different. This wasn't about the press. This wasn't about Meghan. This wasn't about petty grievances. This was about George. And William realized that if he did nothing, if he allowed Harry to remain Duke of Sussex while mocking the heir to the throne, then the monarchy itself would lose its dignity. So William turned to his brother, his voice cutting through the heavy air. You are no longer fit to hold the title of Duke. The words struck like thunder. Harry blinked, stunned. Charles gasped softly. George, too young to understand the gravity, sensed the change in tone, the finality, the authority, the decision that could not be undone. Think about it. Titles are everything in the monarchy. They are not just names. They are shields of dignity, markers of duty, symbols of identity. To strip a title is to strip history itself. Edward VIII lost his crown for love. Andrew was stripped of duties for scandal. But Harry? He was being stripped for something far more personal. For crossing the line between brother and uncle, between man and monarch, between family and dynasty. Harry's face darkened. His defiance faltered for a moment, replaced by disbelief. You can't, he hissed. You have no right. But William did. As heir to the throne, as father of the future king, as the man Charles had just empowered, William had the authority. And more than that, he had the conviction. Here's the irony. Harry had always mocked titles. He claimed he didn't care for them, that he wanted freedom, that the Sussex dukedom meant little in America. Yet when it was taken from him, when the words left William's lips, it cut deeper than any insult. Because this wasn't just about a title. This was about belonging. And with those words, William made it clear, Harry no longer belonged. Let me ask you, can you imagine hearing your own brother tell you that you are no longer worthy of your name, your place, your birthright? Would you laugh? Would you cry? Or would you lash out? Harry lashed out. His voice rose, raw and venomous. He accused William of being a tyrant. He accused Charles of weakness. He accused the entire institution of hypocrisy. But the more he raged, the calmer William became. Because William had crossed the point of no return. He had chosen duty over family, crown over blood. And there was no looking back. Charles, heartbroken, tried one last time to intervene. He whispered Harry's name, his voice trembling. But it was too late. The decision was made. Clarence House had become a courtroom, William the judge, Harry the condemned. And then came the detail that stunned everyone. William didn't just declare it aloud. He ordered it formalized. Advisors were summoned. Aides scribbled notes. The wheels of royal protocol began to turn. What began as words in a drawing room would soon become royal decree. The gravity of it hung heavy. Stripping Harry's title wasn't just a family punishment. It was a public humiliation. It was a signal to the world that Harry had been cast out, not just emotionally, but ceremonially. Here's the contradiction that will haunt this story forever. William acted out of love for his son, yet in doing so, he destroyed his bond with his brother. He saved the monarchy's dignity, yet fractured the family beyond repair. He stood tall as heir, yet felt the sting of betrayal as a sibling. But in William's mind, there was no other choice. To do nothing would have been to betray George. To act was to betray Harry. And William chose George. Always George. The news didn't leave Clarence House that day. Not immediately. But the decision had been made. And within hours, whispers began to spread among aides, advisors, and staff. Harry had been stripped. The Sussex dukedom was gone. Do you see how monumental this was? Never before had an heir to the throne stripped his own brother of a title. This wasn't the king acting. This wasn't Parliament. This was William, future king, protector of George, guardian of the monarchy. And once he had spoken, history had shifted. But here's the question you must ask yourself. Was William right? Was he justified in defending his son at all costs? Or did he go too far, crossing a line that even Diana, in her most desperate days, would have begged him not to cross? Because while William felt he had preserved the future, what he didn't realize was that Harry was about to unleash a fury of his own. And Harry's reaction to being stripped would not just shake Clarence House. It would shake the entire world. What if I told you that Prince Harry's fury that day at Clarence House was unlike anything the royal family had ever seen before? This wasn't the cheeky grin of the spare gone rogue, nor the polished media performance of Netflix cameras. This was raw. This was primal. This was a man who had just been told, by his own brother, that he no longer deserved the name, the dignity, or the title he had carried since birth. Imagine the silence after William's words. You are no longer fit to hold the title of Duke. For a moment, Harry froze. His mouth opened, then shut. His chest rose and fell, faster and faster. He was stunned, humiliated, disbelieving. The room was still. Charles pale, William cold, George clinging to his father's side. The air was thick with tension. And then, like a storm breaking, Harry erupted. His voice rang through the drawing room, echoing against portraits of ancestors who had endured wars, abdications, and scandals. He shouted that William had no right. He accused him of being a dictator in waiting, a man who had already forgotten what it meant to be human in his hunger for the crown. His words dripped with venom. You've become exactly what we always hated, cold, cruel, and obsessed with power. William didn't flinch. Charles tried to intervene, but Harry's rage rolled on. He slammed his fist onto a table, rattling china. He pounded the arm of a chair, his face red, his voice cracking between fury and despair. Here's the contradiction that makes this moment unforgettable. Harry had spent years telling the world he didn't care about titles. He claimed he wanted freedom. That Sussex was just a word, that prince was a burden. Yet, in the instant William took it away, he reacted as though William had ripped away his very identity. Because the truth is, for all his rebellion, Harry's title had always been his anchor, the one thing that gave him relevance across the world. Without it, who was he? Just Harry. Just another celebrity. Just another man. Let me ask you, how would you react if someone stripped away your very name, the thing that made you recognizable, the thing that carried your history? Would you shrug it off? Or would you fight with everything you had left? Harry fought. He lashed out at Charles, accusing him of cowardice, of letting William destroy the family. He shouted at aides hovering nervously in the hallway, telling them they were nothing but pawns in William's power grab. He even turned on George, indirectly, muttering bitter words about the golden child, who would grow up trapped just as he had been. William's hand shot up, silencing him. His voice was sharp, protective. Don't you dare. The tension was unbearable. Charles gripped the arm of his chair, his knuckles white. Advisors exchanged nervous glances. George buried his face into his father's coat. And then Harry said the words that burned the room to ashes. You may strip me of a title, Will, but you will never strip me of the truth. And one day, the world will hear everything. About you, about Kate, about this entire rotten institution." The threat hung in the air like a dagger. It was no longer just family drama. It was war. Here's where the irony bites hardest. By stripping Harry's title, William thought he was protecting the monarchy. But Harry's fury made it clear. The punishment had unleashed a new enemy. An enemy not outside the palace walls, but one who knew every secret inside them. Charles, his voice breaking, pleaded with Harry to stop. He begged him to remember Diana, to remember the bond they once shared. But Harry was past reason. His eyes blazed. His voice shook. He had been humiliated, and in his fury, he vowed revenge. Let's pause. Consider the weight of that vow. A disgraced prince, stripped of his title, exiled from his family, but still armed with knowledge, still armed with secrets. What could he do with them? What would he do with them? The room was chaos. William stone-faced, Charles broken, Harry raging, George terrified. Clarence House had become a battleground, not of fists, but of words that cut deeper than steel. And then, just as suddenly as it began, Harry fell silent. His chest heaved. His eyes glistened, not just with rage, but with something else. Pain, betrayal, loss. He looked at his brother, the man he once idolized, and whispered bitterly, "You've lost me forever." He turned to leave, but not before hurling one final line over his shoulder. "You'll regret this." And with that, the Duke of Sussex, no longer the Duke of Sussex, stormed out of Clarence House, leaving behind a silence so heavy it seemed to crush the room itself. But here's the twist. While William felt he had acted out of duty, while Charles felt he had failed as a father, while George clung to innocence, Meghan was already preparing her own response. And Meghan's reaction would not only add fuel to the fire, it would transform this family feud into an international crisis. What if I told you that Meghan's reaction to Clarence House wasn't shock, wasn't despair, wasn't even disbelief, but calculation? When Harry stumbled back into her world after that explosive confrontation, stripped of his title and dripping with humiliation, Meghan didn't crumble. She sharpened. In that moment, what William saw as Harry's defeat, Meghan saw as opportunity. Picture it. Harry storming out of Clarence House, his voice still echoing with rage, his face flushed, his hands shaking. By the time he reached Meghan, he was broken, deflated by what his brother had done. But Meghan? She wasn't broken. She was furious, yes. Protective, yes. But beneath the fire, she was already plotting, already scripting the narrative, already thinking about how to turn this humiliation into ammunition. Because here's the truth. Meghan had always understood the power of story. She knew how to take a personal slight and transform it into a global cause. Clarence House wasn't just a family argument to her. It was proof of everything she had claimed from the very beginning, that the monarchy was cruel, vindictive, and afraid of her influence. When Harry told her the words, "William stripped me of the title," Meghan's response wasn't a gasp. It wasn't tears. It was cold fury. "Good," she reportedly whispered, her voice steady. "Now they've shown the world exactly who they are. Let's unpack that for a moment." To Meghan, the title had always been double-edged. It gave her status, yes, but it also chained her to an institution she loathed. By losing it, she believed they were free. Free to tell their truth louder, harsher, bolder. Free to expose the palace without restraint. Free to play victim on the biggest stage of all, global media. But here's the contradiction that makes this moment so fascinating. Meghan had once fought desperately to hold on to the Sussex brand. Archewell, their podcasts, their Netflix deals, all of it relied on the royal link. Without the title, they were just another celebrity couple. And yet, when the title was stripped, Meghan didn't panic. She adapted. She reframed. She decided that the narrative of banished royals was even more powerful than discontented royals. Let me ask you, if you were Meghan, would you cling to the dignity of a title, or would you weaponize its removal as proof of persecution? Meghan chose the latter. Behind closed doors, she began sketching the story arc. Harry wasn't disgraced. He was exiled. He wasn't punished. He was silenced. He wasn't stripped. He was sacrificed by a cold, jealous brother. That was the script Meghan began to shape, even as Harry reeled from the humiliation. She spoke to him with fire. She told him the monarchy had played their final card. and now it was their turn. She reminded him of Diana, of how the institution had failed his mother, of how history was repeating itself. She told him that he was not a victim but a warrior, that Clarence House had proved everything they had been saying for years. And Harry, vulnerable, wounded, desperate for validation, believed her. This is where Meghan's genius, or cunning, depending on your view, shines. She didn't just comfort Harry. She redirected him. She turned his rage into fuel, his humiliation into resolve. Where William had sought to cut Harry down, Meghan built him back up with a narrative of righteous vengeance. And behind the scenes, the machinery began to turn. Meghan reached out to allies in the media, carefully chosen journalists who had long been sympathetic to their cause. Whispers began to circulate. William attacked Harry. George was used as a pawn. Charles abandoned his youngest son. The story began to twist, to reshape itself, even before the palace could control it. But Meghan wasn't done. She began planning the counterstrike. A statement, perhaps. A carefully orchestrated public appearance. A new interview that would frame them, once again, as the truth-tellers standing up against an ancient, crumbling system. And here's the irony that will never be forgotten. The palace believed stripping Harry's title would silence him. Meghan understood it would amplify him. Without the constraints of dukedom, Harry could now be portrayed not as a prince, but as a martyr. Imagine the fury inside Meghan as she sat with Harry that night. The disbelief that William, once Harry's closest ally, had dared to humiliate him in front of their father and son. The fury that Charles, the king, had let it happen. The rage that George, the golden heir, had been elevated while her children were cast aside. Every grievance, every resentment, every wound was now sharper. But here's the question. Was Meghan's fury about Harry's humiliation or about her own? Was this about losing the title of Duke and Duchess of Sussex, or about losing control of the narrative? Because while Harry raged at his brother, Meghan raged at the system itself. And in that fury, she made a vow. If William thought this was the end of Harry, then he had underestimated them both. Because Meghan's response wasn't just anger. It was strategy. And that strategy would soon send shockwaves through the monarchy, far beyond Clarence House. But before Meghan's plan could fully unfold, the royal advisors at Clarence House were already scrambling. Because once word of the stripping began to leak, the crisis was no longer private. It was public. And the advisors knew. Once the press got hold of this story, there would be no containing it. What if I told you that while the family war exploded inside Clarence House, the corridors outside were already alive with whispers, footsteps, and frantic messages being passed from aide to aide? Royal advisors, those shadowy figures who live and die by palace stability, knew instantly what William's decision meant. A private quarrel between brothers had just escalated into a constitutional nightmare. And if they didn't act fast, the monarchy itself could be dragged into an inferno of scandal, humiliation, and division. Advisors are often called the gray men of the monarchy. You rarely see them. You rarely hear their names. But in moments like these, they are the ones who decide what the public will know, what the press will be told, and how history will remember the day. And that night at Clarence House, they were in panic mode. Let's set the scene. The door closes behind Harry as he storms out, Meghan waiting in the shadows of the car. Inside the drawing room, William stands rigid, Charles slumped in defeat, George clinging silently to his father's side. But outside that room, advisors are already on their phones, whispering code phrases, texting trusted journalists, preparing draft statements just in case. Because here's the truth. Secrets never stay secrets inside the palace. Staff talk, aides gossip. Even the most loyal footmen can be bribed by the press. And when the words, title stripped, were overheard, the alarm bells rang louder than church bells on Coronation Day. The first question the advisors asked themselves was simple. Do we confirm or deny? If they confirmed that William had stripped Harry of his title, the monarchy risked looking vengeful, divided, and cruel. If they denied it, but the story leaked anyway, they would look deceitful, manipulative, and weak. Either way, the crown was walking into a storm. So the advisors did what they always do first, damage control. They tried to lock the story inside Clarence House. Phones were collected. Staff were warned. Everyone present was reminded of their oaths of silence. But here's the contradiction. They knew it wouldn't hold. It never does. The press already had feelers out. And once Meghan moved, the story would be unstoppable. In one corner of the palace, an advisor whispered the most terrifying words. This could be bigger than Diana. Because think about it. The world had just witnessed the king's younger son stripped of his royal dignity by the heir. This wasn't just scandal, it was Shakespeare. It was betrayal, humiliation, tragedy, and family war rolled into one. And the advisors knew that the press would feast on it like wolves. Their panic turned to strategy. Some argued for a firm statement. Deny the bullying, deny the title stripping, emphasize family unity. Others argued for silence. Let Harry and Meghan scream into the void, and refuse to dignify it with a response. But silence, they knew, was dangerous. Silence would make it look like they were guilty. Let me ask you, what would you have done? If you were an advisor that night, would you push for truth, knowing it would rip the monarchy apart? Or would you bury it, knowing the burial might look like a cover-up? The advisors didn't agree. Tempers flared. Some were loyal to William, insisting that his decision must stand publicly, no matter how brutal it looked. Others were loyal to Charles, begging for delay, for caution, for time to reconsider. But here's the irony. Even as they debated, Meghan was already crafting her counterstrike. She would never let the palace control the narrative, and the advisors knew it. They were preparing for a battle not just of truth, but of perception. And perception is everything in the monarchy. One senior advisor reportedly muttered, "We've lost control. This isn't about facts anymore. This is about who speaks first." And they were right. Because in the age of social media, whoever gets their version of the story out first shapes reality. By the time the palace issues a carefully worded statement, the world has already moved on to Meghan's tears or Harry's rage. The panic grew deeper. What if the public sided with Harry? What if William looked like a tyrant? What if Charles appeared weak? What if George's name was dragged through the mud? The monarchy could survive scandal, but could it survive looking like a family that bullies its own children? And then came the chilling realization. This wasn't just a family problem anymore. It was a constitutional crisis. Harry was still, technically, a prince. He was sixth in line to the throne. If he was stripped of his title in private, what did that mean legally? Did Parliament have to approve it? Did Charles have to sign it? Would lawyers become involved? Advisors knew this wasn't just optics, it was law. And law, once involved, cannot be silenced by palace whispers. So the advisors split into two factions. One demanded immediate legal clarification. The other demanded absolute secrecy. And in the middle sat Charles, broken, exhausted, and unable to decide. Here's where the panic turned to desperation. Some aides began leaking small fragments to trusted reporters, testing the waters, gauging how the press might react if the story broke. They tried to frame William as a protective father, Charles as a torn peacemaker, Harry as the reckless outsider. But the leaks spun out of control. Reporters began calling Clarence House directly. Tabloids hinted at extraordinary developments. And by dawn, the secret was no longer a secret. The advisors had failed. The stripping of Harry's title was about to go public. But here's the twist. When the public finally reacted, it wasn't the monarchy that suffered first. It was Harry. And the firestorm of public reaction would push this family feud into a place darker than anyone imagined. What if I told you that the moment Clarence House failed to keep the secret, the outside world didn't just react? It exploded. Overnight, whispers of what had happened between William and Harry turned into headlines. The words, "title stripped," weren't just in the mouths of palace insiders anymore. They were on breakfast television, plastered across tabloids, dissected by political commentators, and trending on social media feeds from London to Los Angeles. The story had escaped the palace walls, and once it was out, there was no pulling it back in. The first shockwave came in the early hours of the morning. Tabloid journalists, always sniffing for scandal, ran with leaks from palace sources. The front pages screamed of a royal meltdown at Clarence House. Headlines hinted that William had done the unthinkable to his brother. Rumors of bullying, of a confrontation involving Prince George, and of Charles's helplessness spread like wildfire. No one had the full story, but everyone had a piece of it, and those pieces were enough to ignite a frenzy. By mid-morning, the broadcasters had joined in. News anchors delivered their reports with raised eyebrows and ominous tones. Was Harry truly stripped of his dukedom? Had William finally snapped? Was Charles too weak to stop it? Theories multiplied, and with every retelling, the story grew more sensational. And then came the avalanche of public reaction. Social media turned into a battlefield. One side rallied behind William, praising him as a father defending his child, a future king protecting the monarchy from his brother's reckless behavior. Hashtags like #ProtectGeorge and #TeamWilliam surged. Supporters flooded timelines with declarations that William had done what any decent parent would do. The other side? They were furious. To them, Harry was the underdog, the scapegoat, the brother banished for daring to defy the crown. #Justice for Harry and #Abolish the monarchy trended within hours. Meghan's defenders sharpened their claws, ready to frame the incident as proof of everything the couple had been saying for years. The monarchy was vindictive, toxic, and corrupt.